let's get started. Our presenter, Dr. Damon Abdi, is an assistant professor of landscape horticulture at Louisiana State University Ag Center Hammond Research Station. His program seeks to support the sustainability of green industry through developing research-based solutions to address issues such as irrigation, runoff management, plant establishment, temperature moderation in landscape. His extension program focuses on providing usable information to gardeners at every level, meaning it is used by professional horticulturists and homeowners or novice gardeners. We did our graduate school together, and so we had a lot of memories. But today, I think with his awesome presentation, we will create some memories here as well. So with that, it's all to you, Damon.
All right, thank you, Dr. Pujol. Let me get my presentation pulled up. All right, can everybody see it?
We see it in the, yes, we do see it.
All right. So I'm going to get right into it. So good afternoon, everybody. Damon Abdi with the LSU Ag Center Hammond Research Station. So certainly dealing with a little bit of different kind of climate than many of y'all are used to, but a lot of these insights are going to be pretty relevant throughout the country. So I grew up in the Mid-Atlantic, so Maryland, Virginia is kind of my home area. Did my undergrad at Penn State, and then I did graduate school at Michigan State, where me and Dr. Pujol worked together. And now I'm here in Louisiana. So a lot of these insights are going to be relevant to the entire country as a whole. And those insights specifically we're looking at are going to be all sorts of water-wise landscaping, both in terms of the ins and the outs of managing water resources. So to get into it, when we're thinking about the ins and outs, for the ins, we're thinking about how we're applying water. So irrigation practices is a big component of that. We also got to think about our water source, particularly if we're collecting water. And we got to think about the plant selection. What kind of plants are we using? How are we managing those plants? How are we selecting them? And then thinking about the design and the maintenance with those plants. So that's the ins, thinking about where water is going. We also got to think about where water is leaving to, or the outs of water, which encompasses a lot of runoff. So obviously, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term runoff. Going to work on that and then also introduce you to a new phrase, irrigation return flow. Now, it's not just about the volume of water, it's also about the contaminants that are in that runoff water. And then we're also going to touch a little bit on landscape design to address some of those contaminant issues. So a lot of information to cover, so buckle up. So when we're thinking about the water and chemical needs in the landscape, it's unique from other areas of horticulture in that our success is not measured in bushels per acre or livestock produced or any of that. Our goal is simply about optics, and creating an aesthetically pleasing landscape is our primary goal. So we apply irrigation, keep plants from wilting. We put fertilizer down to support that active growth and keep plants looking good. And then we have pesticides, both to protect the plant, but also to protect the landscape itself. Now, these considerations are all inherently linked together, and water is one of the biggest driving forces for all that. So when it comes to irrigation, you won't always need it, but you'll be glad you had it. This is particularly relevant in Louisiana, where we oftentimes get more than sufficient rain to keep our soils nice and wet. Of course, we had a hellacious drought in 2023, so that really opened up our eyes about how important irrigation management can be. So dealing with drought is certainly important, but then also thinking about the optics of plants. We don't want to have wilting plants. It just looks poor and doesn't reflect well upon us. We certainly don't want plants to die as landscape contractors, especially if we have those under warranty. Irrigation can also be used to cool off plants in the heat of the day, but we also use water to water in herbicides, which is very important, and we're going to touch a little bit on that later. But water, with everything, impacts the movement of chemicals, our pesticides, our fertilizer. So water really is that driving force that we need to be really cognizant of how we're managing. So when we're applying water, there's all different ways of applying water, and it's going to vary at different scales of the plant's lifespan, but also in this setup. So at installation, when we're putting in new plants, oftentimes you might see irrigation bags on it. You might also see soaker hoses just to really keep that soil wet. And a lot of times our homeowners are going to hand water. Fortunately, in droughts, a lot of homeowners kind of tell on themselves about their irrigation practices. Other things to consider is the irrigation system. So having a nice fancy irrigation system is well and good, but managing it appropriately is its own consideration. So within irrigation, there's a lot of different ways that we can apply water. In the top left image, you see a drip line putting that water specifically to a location right around the roots of a tree. We might also see micro sprayers like you see in that bottom image where it's projecting water over a larger area. So think about the targeted application of water. We also got to think about the timing of water. So generally it's good to irrigate in the morning. So you let the soil soak up that water and you're not putting water down while there's a lot of hustle and bustle going around for it. And then we also got to think about how we're managing that irrigation. Do we want to put all that water at once, or do we want to split that application up? Give it small amounts to really let the soil digest it and intake that water. So there's a lot of different questions we have in it. Some of you may use irrigation bags. So back in my landscaping days, we'd use this commonly when we were installing new plants. And what's nice about it is in some of those locations, like you see the left image, is you might not have an irrigation system there. And having an irrigation bag allows you to fill that up with water, let it slowly seep out into the environment. But there's also some issues that can happen with that. When you've got a close um, area around it that does not get good airflow because you've got a bag right around it, you might have some disease issues. So you just want to be very cognizant when you're putting these irrigation bags on, not to just leave them on, to continually monitor them, give them some time to remove so that plant can breathe and does not get choked out. If you leave them on for too long, you may get different kind of looking plants than you'd like, such as that image on the right that looks a little bit short and stunted. So just some thoughts on that. But irrigation bags work well in a pinch and super easy to use in commercial sites. Now I got a couple images here that highlight some considerations about irrigation, and you may be questioning why these images are here. Reason is these are examples of where irrigation problems can go wrong. Image on the left, you see there is that emitter that's right up to the sidewalk spraying out into the yard, but you also see that a good bit of that water is going onto the sidewalk. As you can see, that's midday, so the timing, you would have liked to see that go in the morning. So there's one consideration with that. The other thing is it may very well be windy and that's causing the water to go on the sidewalk. Or perhaps the nozzle is not properly oriented. So in either case, you're not getting any value out of putting water on asphalt or on concrete. Central image, you see a drip irrigation that's in there in a very public area, but you see that it's not really well tucked in, so that could certainly be a tripping hazard. You also see a lot of very bare soil, so you've got kind of a tough area for those plants, very compact, very tight. Image on the right, you see a black hose sitting on top of those plants, ostensibly dripping water into each of those landscape beds. But in the heat of summer, what do you think is going to happen to that black hose? Yep, it's going to get super hot and you might have some injury to the plants. So these are just some of the things that walking around, being out and about, I see with irrigation. Now, when we're thinking about water efficiency, one of the most efficient things is to have water that you don't have to necessarily pay for. I'm not sure what the rules and regulations are in Utah about water collection. I've got an image on the next slide, and I'm sure Dr. Pojo will talk a little bit about that at some
I'll put
point.
that in the chat. Yep.
Okay. But collecting rainwater is a good way to reduce your water bill. And something to think about is to make sure that elevated tank is up in the air a little bit. You see that image, and you see that tank has a little concrete ledge that it's hanging off of. So that gives you a little bit of headspace for any kind of drip lines or for water. So you get some of that natural pressure as well. Certainly sufficient for probably most drip irrigation applications, or even just to get a little downhill water from the hose. Tree watering bags, we talked about that as an efficient way, lets water slowly seep in, but the real efficiency with that is the time saving. If you were to go to that small area and apply water, you could apply it all at once, but chances are a lot of it's going to run off. It's not going to have time to seep into the soil. You're going to have issues with that. Instead, You can have a contractor go fill those bags up and then let it slowly seep on its own time, and you don't have to stand there and necessarily watch it. Now, rainwater harvesting, so that's going to vary by state. There's different kinds of installation codes. For example, if you're collecting rainwater, it's not advised to use it as a source of potable or drinking water. In some cases, you're not allowed to, whether you want to or not. But it makes sense. You don't want to drink water straight off the rooftop. In some states, it's encouraged or even incentivized. So there may be tax credits or state-specific resources to help you achieve that. So there's some good information out there. I'm sure Dr. Podell will talk more about that. Rainwater harvesting, it can be, you can go big, you can go small with it. On the image on the right, that's at the State Botanical Garden of Georgia. So you see a pretty large water tank there. But then on the left, you see an image just from a house in New Orleans. But the same concepts, you're having it slightly elevated and you're having it collect water straight from the roof. So you can do this big scale, you can do the small scale, with plenty of different options for it. Now, with all landscaping, especially when you're thinking about water, you want to understand the conditions of your site. So the first thing you should really think about doing is getting a soil test. So a soil test is going to tell you a lot of really good information. You're going to have a good idea for how well water might drain or may not drain. The advice that I always give to landscapers is to visit a site when it's raining if you're curious about what the drainage patterns are. So you can guess all you want. You can bring your transit out there and shoot levels, but if you really want to see where the water's flowing, go out during or immediately after rain. You also want to think about the climate and the microclimate. So certainly between Louisiana and Utah, we have vastly different climates. But within one particular site, you may have several different microclimates. Take, for example, this image from right outside my station. We get the full brutal force of that Louisiana heat and sun all summer. And this little spot out here is protected by the shade of a nice magnolia tree and has benches there that people can enjoy it. And we take stock of these existing plants. So we want to do our best to protect that existing southern magnolia there and really think about what we can do with this site that encourages its use. So obviously this is a public sitting area, so you're trying to embrace that shade. Wouldn't make sense to clutter it with a bunch of other things there that kind of get away from the point of having that site. So knowing our soil, that's very important. We think about soil texture, so we're all used to the triangle, the sand, silt, and clay, and all that. And we know that coarse soils or sandy soils are going to drain faster. And we know that fine soils are also going to drain slower. So having more clay in the soil is going to slow down drainage. But clay particles in soil also provide absorption sites for phosphorus. So when we're thinking about a fertilizer management plan, a clay soil may very well have tons of phosphorus already within it. Soil organic matter is super important. So a soil with high organic matter is going to have more absorption sites. Organic matter also helps with a variety of other things, create a strong microbiome, retain water, help drainage, all sorts of good stuff that come with soil organic matter. And then pH. So soil pH is very important, and that dictates nutrient availability, which leads us into fertilizer. So whether we're in a nursery or landscape, fertilizer is important to keep plants growing and looking excellent. So we really want to make sure that there's optimum levels of fertilizer for good vigorous growth and for the plant, lest you get chlorotic effects such as this. And you don't want to have to go trying to convince people this is some variegated cultivar when it's really just some kind of nutrient or micronutrient deficiency. So thinking about really managing the fertilizer and how it interacts with our soil, soil test is the first thing you want to do. That'll tell you your pH, tell you your fertilizer levels. And remember, pH determines the bioavailability of nutrients. So you can have all the phosphorus in the world in the soil, but if your pH is not appropriate, it's not going to be available to the plant. So this handy little image here represents different nutrients, and the thicker the bar, the more available those nutrients are. And as a general rule, kind of looking at that 6.5 to 7 is that sweet spot for the pH you want to have your major nutrients be available. If you go too acidic or too alkaline, you may have some issues. That comes with the caveat that some plants, certainly here our azaleas, our camellias, they do indeed prefer more acidic soils. But either way, if you don't have the information, how are you going to manage it? So soil test is very important. You may very well have sufficient fertilizer already there, and adding more fertilizer will not do you any good. Instead, you may want to look at modifying your pH. For cases like clay soils, where you know you've got a clay soil, you may very well already have sufficient phosphorus in that soil, which means you don't get anything out of applying more. So just consider that and get that thorough information so you can make the best management choices as possible and may not need to apply that extra phosphorus. Now, pesticides, when we're applying insecticides or fungicides, we're really working to protect the plant's aesthetic. We got fall webworm growing right up there on one of our plants. And when you see those insects shaking around and that web's up there, it really is deleterious to the aesthetics of the landscape. And we're applying insecticides or fungicides to keep our plants looking good. On the other hand, herbicides are very valuable because they're protecting the landscape's aesthetics. So weeds are going to have competition for nutrients and water, harbor pests and disease, and cause other issues. Most notably, that's the first thing your eyes go to. You don't care about the Tradescantia or the Plectranthus that's grown in there. You are too fixated on that chamber bitter that is growing within that landscape bed. And that's why when you're managing weeds in a landscape bed, it can be pretty tough. So landscape beds are certainly not a monoculture. You've got a diverse mix of plants spanning many different species, many different needs, growth habits, etc. And the weeds, yes, you can see them up close, but addressing them is its own challenge because they may be hard to see or they may be hard to reach. And there's very little opportunities for a burn down or an overhauling of existing landscape beds, unless we're really thinking about annual color beds that we're really trying to plant at different parts of the season. So our best efforts are going to be leveraged towards preventative measures to keep those weeds from coming up before it becomes a big challenge. So that's why we put down pre-emergent herbicides. Now, pre-emergent herbicides are there to arrest weed development before they become an issue. So when you're applying that, whether as granules or whether you're spraying it, many of you probably apply Snapshot. I know I put down a lot of that back in my landscaping days. You're putting down these pesticides to provide an active ingredient that kills off these weeds before they become a problem. Now, watering in is incredibly important for pre-emergent herbicides because it moves that active ingredient into the soil. So having that active ingredient at the surface is not going to help as much as if you have it a little bit deeper in the soil that's going to help it arrest those weeds. And when you're also watering in, you can wash a little bit of that pre-emergent herbicide off the foliage. So especially if you're spraying over the top. And remember, pre-emergent herbicides are designed to kill germinating weeds, young weeds. Your mature plants are hopefully tolerant to a lot of these pre-emergent herbicides, but it's incredibly important you read the label. So your pre-emergent herbicides are going to say what kind of weeds it will kill, but it'll also say what kind of landscape plants that you have a reasonable degree of comfort are not going to get hurt when you're applying these pesticides at label recommendations and in the right way. So if there's one thing you should take away from this, it's read the label for your pesticides. Now, watering in is very important, and the movement of agrochemicals is really the crux of that. Now, agrochemical movement is going to depend on physiochemical properties. So solubility is one of the biggest things. So pesticides such as acephate, which if you've ever sprayed it, you know how rough that smells, but also nutrients, nitrate, those are very soluble in water. Those are going to readily dissolve in water and are easy to apply. So that will go inside the water. On the other hand, you've got pesticides that are less soluble. And these less soluble pesticides are more likely to adsorb where they're going to bind to different features in the landscape, such as soils or organic carbon. Bifenthrin is an example of a pesticide that binds readily, and phosphate is, as we mentioned, binds to clay soils. So really think between solubility and absorption as key dictators of the movement of agrochemicals. And a good way to remember that is something that a pesticide that is not soluble is essentially like mixing oil and water together. If you mix oil and water together, those are not going to stay mixed. You got to keep it agitated or else it's going to separate out. Same thing with pesticides that are not soluble. Those will separate out and not dissolve in the water. So just keep that in mind. Regardless of whether these contaminants are dissolved in water or are binding to something in the environment, they can move. So whether it's moving in an aqueous phase or getting washed out via erosion, you can still have some issues. But that's just the general look at how different agrochemicals move. In a practical sense, when you're putting down pre-emergent, again, it's important to water in. So read the label. I beat a dead horse better than anybody. Really read that label. It's going to give you information on the watering in volume. So typically about 1/2 inch of rain or irrigation is recommended. So with that, you want to revisit what your irrigation system is. That image on the top right, a drip irrigation system is not going to provide water that covers the entire area and help move that active ingredient through the soil level. Whereas overhead or spray irrigation is going to cover an entire area and really help push that active ingredient down. Now, not every site's going to have overhead irrigation, drip irrigation, or any irrigation for that matter. So do you intend to hope for rain or do you bring in the water tank? These are questions that you're going to have to make in the field. Now, pre-emergent herbicides you want to water in, but that is not true for all pesticides. Really, that's just for your pre-emergent herbicides. For insecticides and fungicides, remember, we want to keep those on the plant. Our pre-emergent herbicides water into the soil, but insecticides and fungicides aren't any good unless they're maintained on the plant. Of course, exceptions being if you're doing some sort of soil drench or something with that with different kinds of pesticides. But generally, when you're spraying pesticides or fungicides on a plant, you want that to stay on the plant. Maintain that on the plant and not wash it off. So you don't want to put insecticides or fungicides and then irrigate. You don't want to put insecticides and fungicides and then have a heavy rain happen. That's just no good. So if you really want to think about a overall herbicide, insecticide, and fungicide plan of action, you might consider putting your pre-emergent herbicide down first, thinking about what makes sense. Are you going to put it as a granular? If you're using a shaker can of Snapshot, for example, that makes sense in the landscape and small landscape beds. But if you've got thousands of container crops, putting granulars into each one is probably not the best use of your time. Spraying, on the other hand, will cover a larger area. Ups and downs to both, just depends on your site. Either way, you want to water in that pre-emergent so that it washes in the soils and then it washes off the plants. And then finally, you want to put your insecticide and your fungicide application. So that provides that protective coat on the plant tissue. And your goal is to avoid washing that off foliage. Now, it's important to know your plants. It's not just a cool party trick, but it's going to help you make management decisions in all facets: water, fertilizer, pesticides. So knowing your plants, it's important to know what species you have and then think about what the timeline in the landscape is. You've got a historic live oak that's well over 100 years up in that top image. You've got a planting bed of coleus on that bottom image that could very well have been planted a week before, heck, a day before, for all we know. Now, these are going to have different needs. An established mature tree is going to be well rooted and have more access to water. It's going to be pretty self-sufficient. Certainly in our area, we don't really have to worry about more mature trees getting irrigated in typical seasons. But the drought of 2023 changed that. We had to do some deep watering with some of those trees, give it a nice thorough soak. That was how we'd have to manage more mature trees. But for a landscape bed that might be shallow rooted, you're going to have to do a little bit more frequent irrigation, especially in the heat of summer where plants may very well wilt very quickly. So you see that patch of coleus down there, and you see that there is a little area of it that is very visibly wilting. So coleus, certainly in our experience, is very, very thirsty plant. And when you see a mass like that, it indicates that you probably need a little bit more irrigation. So that's an indicator that you need to apply more irrigation. But furthermore, you look at how that's just localized to one small patch. Now, if there's drip irrigation or something that's keeping that small patch from being hydrated, you may have to repair your irrigation or figure out what's going on there. But it indicates that there's a problem. Now, many of us have certainly heard about grouping plants by similar water demand. That's a good practice. That way we can keep irrigation practices pretty uniform for a landscape bed. But also think about grouping by pesticide tolerance and use, especially when you're thinking about pre-emergence. You want to have plants that are going to be tolerant to those pre-emergence. And then also for insecticides, when you're thinking about the bloom timing of the different plants and you're trying to think about how to kill off pests without harming any pollinators, you might want to consider how those different plants go through the life cycle at different times. So it's important to know your plants. Now, like I mentioned, in New Orleans, in Louisiana, we get plenty of rain generally, but 2023 changed all that. So when it does not rain, we got to make sure that we are prepared for some resilience to drought. So you want to select plants that are going to thrive in dry conditions, and you want to think about the irrigation management, and you want to think about the water sourcing. So certainly irrigation is important for us. It is incredibly important for all y'all too, even more so. And you really want to think about cultural practices, anywhere from mulching to help keep evaporation off to simply paying attention. A lot of landscapes fail because people are neglecting it or just not keeping on top of it. So it's important to keep an eye on your installations. You see this far too often. So kind of going back into the plant selection, you really want to support a diverse, resilient landscape. Not only does having a nice mix of plants increase appeal and give you a reason to get excited for every season, but it also provides resilience to biotic and abiotic stressors and supports biodiversity. Over 100 years ago, many of our great American cities were lined with elm trees, with that nice, graceful, upright habit. It was a real benefit in street side plantings. You'd see so many historic streets lined with that. Certainly, the Dutch elm disease caused a lot of issues. And because there was a monoculture, because there was just really one species that was planted there in a lot of these streets, when that wreaked havoc, a lot of plants were lost and there was nothing to really take its place. But through challenges, we always find something to learn in every season. And an example of this would be in our drought of 2023, we saw that Vitex, flowering tree, performs very, very well in our landscape despite the extensive drought and the extensive heat. So we always try to find something to get excited about. And it's also about thinking about different sites on a landscape and how we might manage them and design them to be a little bit more efficient. So if you spend any time in parking lots, you'll notice that there's a lot of isolated areas amidst a sea of asphalt that have to be maintained. And you see a turf grass plot like that that would have to be mowed. Now, realistically, you're not going to run your 48-inch mower deck over that. You're probably going to take a weed eater and give it a little haircut several times throughout the year to keep that going. But instead, if you replace that with something a ground cover like liriope in our area, you get a similar appearance to turf, even though liriope is not a turf, but you get that same effect. You get plant material in there, and the maintenance for that is really just a simple haircut once a year, maybe. So just think about ways that you can design a landscape so that way you can mitigate areas that are going to be very high intensive. Certainly turf needs a lot of water. And turf is great for a lot of applications. You're not going to go play football, baseball, or soccer over a bed of liriope, but that doesn't mean, on the other hand, that we need everything to be covered in turf either. So just think about that. So that's really about the ins of water. So we kind of went through all that quick and fast. Now we're going to think about runoff water versus irrigation return flow. So runoff water is a term many of you are probably used to already. And what comes to mind? Well, I think it's pretty easy to imagine when we're in an urban area or we're in anywhere where we see hard rains hit the ground and that soil is not going to soak up all that water fast enough. Instead, it's going to flow downhill and collect somewhere else. Now, irrigation return flow is different. It's not really different from runoff in either of those factors, except irrigation only occurs in irrigated areas. So runoff can come from precipitation. Irrigation return flow implies that irrigation is the source. So it only comes from irrigation water. And the distinction really depends on the situation. So when you think about farms, nurseries, heavily irrigated areas, that's irrigation return flow. But an urban area, a non-irrigated area, rainfall is going to lead to runoff. What about landscapes? What about them? Well, it depends if it's irrigated or not. And then golf courses, certainly golf courses are very heavily irrigated. So just think about how the source of the water that you're putting in can impact that. In either case, you really can't help runoff water. If it rains, it pours, but you can control irrigation return flow by changing irrigation methods. And we talked about a little bit about different ways of applying irrigation, timing, etc. But that's its own discussion, and that's not something we're really going to get into today. Now, the problem with runoff water irrigation return flow is that a heavy rain or irrigation event can put down a ton of water really, really quickly. So you're dealing with large volumes of water. But that water can also transport contaminants. So agricultural areas, you might see fertilizers, pesticides, or animal waste or some other kinds of things like that that can be transported. Lawn and landscapes, certainly you'll see fertilizers and pesticides as well. Urban areas, you can get a wide range of urban pollutants. You might get large physical objects, trash. You might also get a range of contaminants of concern. You might get oils, you might get pharmaceuticals. It varies. You also get heavy metals, fertilizers, and pesticides as well. So you get a lot of different kind of contaminants in runoff water. The other thing to consider is in urban areas, you've got more impervious surfaces. So it's one thing if it rains heavily on a grassed field. It's another thing if it rains heavily on a parking lot. So just keep that in mind. Now, the big issues with that runoff water, focusing specifically on agrochemical contaminants, would be nutrients from fertilizer. So eutrophication, which is spurred by nitrates and phosphates. These same nutrients that help our plants grow certainly help algal blooms grow. No, that is not a putting green. That is a pond out here that has got a lot of algae growing. Pesticides also pose their own issues, so they can build up in the environment. They can also build up in bioaccumulators species going up the food chain. And you can have all kinds of ecotoxicity. We don't want a bunch of pesticides getting into our fish and into our other aquatic life. We also got to be considerate about ourselves, drinking water contamination. So range of contaminants have some issues. Nitrate specifically, when we've got a drinking water standard of 10 parts per million, 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate, because levels at that level or above can lead to blue baby syndrome, and we do not want to see any issues with that. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to take a multi-fold approach, just using this as an example. Treating water, we got 3 steps. We got to clean up the ponds or surface water. We got to identify where the issue is. And then we got to figure out a way to keep this from creeping back up. So step 1 is cleaning up the water. Now we can do physical removal. It's cumbersome, it's difficult, but it's a good first step. And then chemical removal may be necessary. Again, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, check the label for everything. Make sure that you're doing things by the book so that you don't get in trouble, you don't get fined. And check the label again just for good measure. Chances are you're going to be using a suite of chemicals that you should be very familiar with. So know that label, eat, sleep, and breathe it, and you'll be good. So in this case, when we were addressing some of our pond issues, we had to get creative, and we tried to lift out some of this algae, got a little bit of it cleared out, but that was not going to be nearly enough to take care of the job. Physical removal helped a little bit though. Band-Aid solution made it easier to see the pond. We could maybe assess our next steps, and that anywhere near intake fountains or anything else, we could be able to declog some of these features. But again, this is labor intensive, time intensive, and there is no easy way to do it. Fortunately, there are aquatic herbicides that are specifically for this use. I'm not going to speak to the efficacy of any individual compound, but I'm just using this as a reference. So this would be an aquatic herbicide. You'll read the label and it's going to have all information on the active ingredient and the environmental hazards. And then it's also going to have information on what it controls, application rates, application directions. Now, read that label, eat, sleep, and breathe it, but make sure that you're consulting with the appropriate officials and just make sure you're doing things by the book. You don't want to have any issues to the environment due to negligence. So just keep that down. And now delving a little bit deeper into the issues that you get when you've got algal mats growing on that, the breakdown of algae and aquatic plant material consumes oxygen from the water. So as those materials are dying out, the bacteria are breathing as they're chewing that up and decomposing it. But remember, fish need oxygen too, and there's dissolved oxygen in water. We need to make sure that there's sufficient dissolved oxygen in water so that fish can breathe and so that these biological processes can take place. And it's really important not to upset the balance of the ecosystem. So you see a lot of times these fish kills happen like in the Gulf of Mexico and Lake Erie, where you've got these algal blooms that occur. And then as those blooms decompose, the bacteria consume all that oxygen and suddenly the fish don't got anything to breathe left. So you want to make sure you're following best management practices and really protecting your ecosystem. So you want to think about a combination of chemical and physical. How much chemicals would it take to kill off all this algae? Some physical removal may be necessary. And then what sustainable practices can help the algae from developing again? So think about it, if you've got a muddy kitchen floor, if there's just a bunch of mud and dirt all over that floor, you're not going to want to put your cleaner over that. You're just going to mix it up with that mud. You need to get rid of that mud first, or at least enough of it so that way you can actually put that chemical to clean. So just think about that. Now, anybody who's spending time, effort, and money to get rid of the algae doesn't want to have to do it a second time, third time, or any more than that. What sustainable practices can help the algae from developing again? And there's several different approaches you can take. So when you're thinking about sustainable pond management, aerators are going to help circulate water. So obviously you're breathing more oxygen into it by chewing that up. It prevents that still water. And that's nice because it can help push some of those mats of algae out towards the edges of those ponds that could then be taken up and removed physically. So that's good. And it also kind of keeps that water moving a little bit. Of course, aerators also add oxygen to water, aids in some of that decomposition, and helps to support a healthy aquatic life. So step 2, when we're identifying where the issue is coming from, like I say, observe the drainage of the site, very important. In a nursery, you might have drainage channels, you might have areas all throughout the nursery that are collecting water and channeling it through. And you know you've got a very, very specific fertilizer source. Heck, you're growing the plants right there. You can pinpoint exactly, point that source out. Landscape can be a little bit more challenging. So if you're working in neighborhoods, the water that's collecting at the edges of it, you don't know necessarily whose lawn that is. You don't know necessarily what the different people's management practices are. In either case, you want to observe the drainage of the site, see where that water's going. And that's where you address the issue at this location. So runoff water treatment systems, you can intercept runoff water before it gets to retention ponds, and you can remove contaminants. So by intercepting it, you're pre-filtering that water before it even reaches the reservoir, but you can also remove sediments that are moving in water. So remember, we say not all contaminants are going to dissolve in water. A lot of them are in fact going to bind to soils or organic matter that's then going to get washed off or eroded from a site. And then when you're removing contaminants, our goal really is, in this case, to reduce the amount of fertilizer and pesticide contaminants moving in that water. So there's a variety of water treatment systems. You're probably familiar with constructed wetlands and rain gardens. You're maybe not familiar with bioreactors. Well, a constructed wetland and rain garden can be small or it can be large. In the image on the left, you see a very public site, and you see those baffles filled with different kind of coarse rock. And as you can see, the water is going to meander and wind its way down that path. And those baffles are there to slow down the movement of water, help some of those sediments settle out. And you got plants there that are helping to take up nutrients as well. So the key thing there is it's slowing down the flow of water, helping trap sediments, making a difference that way. In a small case, in a home landscape, you might see a rain garden. We got a bunch of irises growing in there. Rain garden, we'll talk a little bit more on that, but that's probably a term I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So these two are things that you have probably not seen for the first time. On the other hand, you've probably not heard of what a bioreactor is, and it's a fancy name for a very simple system. So biological, reactor, reaction, and these are biologically driven reactions. Now, wood chip bioreactor is driving very specific reactions through a simple way. Wood chip bioreactor is a lined trench most often seen in the upper Midwest, and that's filled with wood chips. That's a cheap available carbon source, and we all know bacteria love their carbon. Now the native bacteria colonize these wood chips, they're already existing on it, and then the runoff water is passing through these systems. So in an agronomic setting, like these are most common in the Iowa and Illinois areas, the big corn and soy, the agronomic areas, you got tile drainage from those fields that are getting piped into these bioreactors. And the bacteria take care of all that. So the bacterial communities, they're thriving, they're loving life, they got all the carbon they need, they got plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus. And the bacteria can degrade, transform, and remove contaminants. So nitrogen, nitrates can be removed through denitrification, but a host of other kind of contaminants can be removed through other biological practices. But also physically, wood chips as that organic matter, like we talked about earlier, those can be absorption site. Those can bind contaminants. So wood chips can be used in as that physical filter as well. So to really kind of keep it all simple and easy to remember, a bioreactor, it's a trench with carbon, oftentimes is how it's seen. Nitrates are biologically changed to nitrogen gas. Soluble pesticides may move freely, but bacteria will chew them up. And then less soluble pesticides may indeed stick to wood chips and degrade over time. Now, how well these system works depends on a variety of factors, including treatment time, nitrogen removal. You can get very good nitrogen removal in less than a day to very complete nitrogen removal in about 3 days. And then pesticides, that can vary. So if pesticides are going to stick, they'll bind very quickly. So published some work on that, and another article just came out today. So it's some interesting work in the future. That all sounds really intensive, probably not something you're clamoring to do, but for a home landscape, what can you do? What is sustainability? That we hear this term thrown around all the time, but it can always really be tied back to right plant, right place. So when you're thinking about the right plant, right place, when you're thinking about water, think about what plants handle wet soils, what plants handle droughts, what plants have resiliency to extreme conditions in both ends. And you want to understand the conditions of the site. We did a whole little thing about site assessments and analysis, so think about that. Then embrace the site. If you got an area that's consistently saturated, you can spend a lot of time and effort trying to keep it dry, or you can just embrace it. On the other hand, if you've got a site that stays really, really dry, it makes sense to pick drought tolerant plants for that. Now, rain gardens, I'm usually dealing with too much water in Louisiana, so rain gardens is a big thing I look at. Rain garden is simply just a garden in a low area of the landscape, collects water, retains that water, lets it seep into the ground, helps reduce pollutants. You get all these other benefits. It looks good and helps support biodiversity. To build a rain garden, find that low area. You're not going to build a rain garden at the top of the hill. You're going to find your low spot. You're going to excavate maybe half a foot and get that little kind of soup bowl down there. But remember, as y'all know, before you put a shovel in the ground, you're calling 811 to make sure you don't hit any utilities. You want to install site appropriate plants. So as a simple example, here's a small home rain garden. You see the little outline shape there. You got sweet bay magnolia that's growing in there, and the plant's slightly below grade. And then you've got some irises as well all around it. So you got some plants that are well adapted to wet conditions. This is a small, really appropriate rain garden for a small residential site. And you may notice that little gravel line that's coming up in that top left part of that rain garden. And that is indeed a French drain. So a big part of landscaping is doing all kinds of site work outside of plants. And French drains take water from one location, whether it's piped in from the roof or just in a low spot, and drains it somewhere else. So you can have it take in near the foundation where you don't want that water, and then pump it out closer to the street or somewhere more appropriate so that way it's not causing issues. And I write fact sheets on things like this, so there's all kinds of materials out there. And I also work with several of my local stakeholders in devising some of these systems and really extolling the benefits of them. And you can get creative with it. Simple little planter box on the side of a house, you can pipe in a rooftop rain garden like this. But that way you're collecting that water off the roof and slowing it down before it collects in the rest of your landscape. So just think about some questions. When it rains, it pours, or so we think. So we got to know, how wet will soils typically be? Huge difference between periodic and sustained saturated soils. You also got to think about when you have droughts. So plants that can withstand considerable drought, a lot of grasses have good tolerance for this, ornamental grasses. Plants that grow best with moist soils, occasional floods, you're typically going to see shrubs and perennials. Plants that tolerate longer periods of flooding, so think things in Louisiana like bald cypress. You want to think about the impact, the layout, and the planning of this rain garden, and then how you're going to manage it. So something else, probably more germane to when you've got more drier climates and you're not getting that consistent rain, having a thick layer of mulch is going to help for your rain gardens. So you want that water to seep out, you want that water to evaporate off, but you don't want it to happen so quickly that your plants get thirsty. A thick layer of mulch is going to do a lot of benefit, moderate soil conditions, maintain moisture better, and it's also going to keep the soil temperature a little bit more moderated. So just think about that from design. Just to close things out, I always like to have examples of things. So a couple images here. You see a drainage pipe on the left. You see a drainage inlet there. It's surrounded by irises. So water is going to drain through there. But in an urban landscape, those irises could be used to exclude trash, plastic bags, etc., from getting caught up in that drain, preventing flooding. On the right, you've got a more creative parking lot, a very nice, natural looking mix of plants that encourages water to go into that. Why worry about irrigating your strips in parking lot medians when you can let nature take care of it without managing? A couple other things. So I've got these images sent to me from some collaborators. These probably hit a little bit closer to home for y'all with the Denver Botanic Garden. So you see a nice mix of different plants. So when you're picking a diversity of plants, those root systems can help infiltrate water, help really open up those pores and support drainage. And then on the image on the right there, you see a drainage ditch, and having vegetation there is going to help lock down that soil so it's not eroding, but also slow down the water and make it look a little bit better. In urban environments, so we talk a lot about rooftops and collecting rainwater on rooftops. Having a little bit of green roof action can help as well. So that's cuts into how much water you got to manage, but it also gives you a little bit of something else to be excited about in the landscape. And with that, I think I'm exactly at 45 minutes. So I'd like to open it up to questions, and thank y'all for having me here.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you maybe next month.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again.